Under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party, open discussion of post-1949 Chinese history has gradually become a taboo. Perspectives that diverge from the official narrative are systematically discouraged, and certain major events and figures have been deliberately suppressed, fading into forced oblivion. This is a new series in which I will re-examine through the eyes of an ordinary Chinese individual the history of what I call China's Communist Dynasty, from its founding in 1949 to the present, a history the party would rather keep hidden. While official accounts emphasize the glory and the achievements of the state, the lived reality of this dynasty has been defined by the concentration of absolute power in the hands of its rulers. To a remarkable extent, the trajectory of the People's Republic of China has been shaped by three pivotal figures: Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and Xi Jinping. Accordingly, I divide modern Chinese history into three chapters. Today, we begin with the first, the Mao Era. Mao Zedong was born into a peasant family in 1893 during the late Qing dynasty of China. His childhood was largely similar to that of other rural children of his time. In 1912, the Republic of China was established, bringing an end to the imperial Qing dynasty. During the 1910s, a large number of Chinese intellectuals introduced Western ideas such as democracy and science, which most Chinese had little exposure to before. With strong support from these intellectuals and some backing from the new government, Mao in his youth was able to receive a relatively open and pluralistic education. This cultivated in him a lifelong passion for reading, through which he became captivated by Marxist communism and committed himself to the path of communist revolution. The year 1917 marked a turning point when Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik Party successfully seized power in Russia. Prior to this, no communist party had ever succeeded in establishing a functioning state regime. Thus, the victory galvanized Chinese left-wing intellectuals, offering a real-world blueprint demonstrating that workers and peasants, rather than traditional elites, could indeed hold the reins of power. In response, they began to vigorously promote communist ideology across China and founded the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, as a radical alternative to the more elitist Chinese Nationalist Party, or the Kuomintang, that governed the nation since 1912. The CCP was founded in 1921, with Mao attending as a delegate from Hunan. In its early years, the party slowly built influence at the grassroots level. At the same time, the Kuomintang government, legitimate in name but weak in practice, struggled to assert control over a China fractured by warlords. Recognizing the CCP's capacity for mass mobilization and organization, the Kuomintang entered into an alliance with the communists to confront the warlord problem. The CCP, for its part, also embraced this first united front as a means of enhancing its political legitimacy and expanding its influence. However, in 1927, as the mission to neutralize the warlords neared completion, the Kuomintang launched a sudden and violent purge against the communists. This crackdown forced the CCP to abandon urban centers and retreat to remote rural areas where Kuomintang control was weakest. There, they established their own self-governing enclaves, famously known as revolutionary base areas, within which Mao spearheaded a land revolution, seizing land from landlords and redistributing it to the peasantry. Thanks to this campaign, the long-neglected rural underclass experienced a newfound sense of dignity. Meanwhile, Mao's natural ability to connect with the peasantry earned him immense devotion, transforming him into a populist hero. This surge in grassroots support revitalized the party and paved the way for Mao to be formally elevated to the party's top leadership in 1935. In 1937, following the Japanese invasion of China, internal dissent within the Kuomintang grew, with calls to temporarily halt the persecution of communists. This pressure ultimately led to the formation of the Second United Front between the two parties against Japan. Under the cover of this wartime chaos, the CCP rapidly expanded its influence, not only in terms of manpower and grassroots prestige, but also in its military capacity. 8 years later, with the surrender of Japan bringing the World War II to an end, the two parties immediately resumed the civil war. It concluded with the defeat of the Kuomintang, who retreated to Taiwan, while the CCP went on to establish the largest communist regime in the world since the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, in 1949. Following the founding of the PRC, Mao and his fellow revolutionaries finally had the stage to implement their communist ideals across the nation on a grand scale. In the 1950s, the CCP initiated the nationalization of private enterprises and factories, actualizing the Marxist concept of collective ownership of the means of production. The state-led collective planned production was swiftly implemented, and its main implementing units were later formally established as people's communes. All peasants were required to join such institutions in their respective regions, within which they performed collective assigned labor. Their production quotas were determined by specialized officials according to supposedly scientific calculation. These national targets were set at the top and cascaded down as regional quotas, with grain output and steel production serving as the two primary indicators of success. In terms of popular response, due to the overall optimism in society in the early years of PRC, combined with deep emotional bond formed during the revolution, the populace threw themselves into collective production with unprecedented fervor. Gradually, however, this constructive campaign shifted into a nationwide frenzy that led to counterproductive actions. In steel production, for example, many citizens melted down finished household items such as iron pots, pans, and shovels in an attempt to meet quotas and win government approval, producing crude, useless pig iron and causing a massive waste of resources. Meanwhile, a similar zealous ethos extended to collective agriculture. Communes began concealing real figures and exaggerating their outputs, competing to report blatantly unrealistic production data. In 1958, the state media, People's Daily, infamously reported that a commune's field had reached a yield of 18,000 kilograms per Chinese acre, even though actual yields at the time peaked around only 500 kilograms. In my own birthplace back then, when central officials arrived to tally the harvest, local cadres would scatter a thin layer of wheat over a high mound of earth, pointing to it from a distance to trick the inspectors into believing that they had a massive surplus. Believing these fabricated figures, the central government established an exorbitant grain procurement system intending to use rural production to supply cities and repay debts to the Soviet Union. By 1959, the procurement rate in some regions exceeded 40%, leaving the peasantry with virtually no grain for survival. However, in the absence of a sound legal system, society had no effective mechanism to stop this collective hysteria. It relied solely on the party's central policymakers to intervene. But the problem was that Mao himself deeply admired what he believed to be the people's passion for production. He seemed less concerned with the actual yield than with sustaining that enthusiasm to keep this communist carnival alive. In the late 1950s, Mao defined this fervor as a social movement known as the Great Leap Forward and championed the slogan, "The greater the audacity, the higher the yield." Consequently, adjusting to policy became synonymous with opposing Mao. Given the comrade unmatched prestige, challenging him carried political risks no one in the party was willing to take. As a result, the party's decision-making stalled, while the peasants' grain reserves dwindled to nothing. Ultimately, from 1959 to 1961, a catastrophic famine erupted. Statistics estimate that 15 to 45 million Chinese perished, a toll far exceeding the total military and civilian casualties of World War I. This period stands as one of the darkest chapters of China and indeed human history. Never before has a nation endured such a massive scale of unnatural death during peacetime. In 1961, faced with the undeniable reality of the famine, the party finally convened to adjust its policies. Liu Shaoqi, then the nominal president of the PRC, pointed out publicly but cautiously that erroneous policies were the primary cause of the disaster. Meanwhile, Liu and his political partner Deng Xiaoping, both veterans of the Civil War and top-level leaders before 1966, pursued recovery from the famine largely by circumventing Mao's oversight. As for Mao, although he had been in semi-retirement, he continued to exert immense influence behind the scenes, which led him to perceive Liu and Deng's behavior as an attempt to sideline him and even undermine his authority. Furthermore, Liu and Deng's recovery measures partially introduced elements resembling private ownership and free market competition to incentivize peasant productivity. This gave Mao the leverage he needed, as such an approach deviated not only from Mao's vision, but also, in Mao's interpretation, from orthodox socialist principles of collective ownership and the central planned economy. By the mid-1960s, seeking to shatter the party bureaucracy and regain his dominance, Mao weaponized the ideology. He branded those shunning him or limiting his influence as enemies of the glorious communist cause. In 1966, he formally declared that a group of bourgeois representatives had infiltrated the party. In order to combat these internal class enemies, Mao called upon the masses to write short articles criticizing, denouncing, and even personally attacking them, which were then publicly displayed in the form of political posters. He even led by example and famously wrote his own political poster titled "Bombard the Headquarters," directly targeting Liu Shaoqi. Mao's call encouraged the public to wage struggle against the so-called hidden class enemies within society. This mentality spread rapidly across China and was later escalated and formalized into a mass movement known as the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. During the Cultural Revolution, with the backing of numerous incited masses, Mao was able to persecute his political rivals within the party openly and with apparent moral justification. Many senior officials, including Deng, were consequently subjected to internal exile, sent to remote regions, and thereby removed from the center of power. As for Liu, the nominal head of state, he was stigmatized as the foremost internal enemy of the Chinese people. The grave political charge led him to be placed under secret detention, punctuated by repeated public humiliation. In 1969, weakened by illness, prolonged physical abuse, and poor living conditions, Liu died in custody. Even his body was only allowed to be released for cremation after his name on his death tag had been altered. On the other hand, the Cultural Revolution did not remain confined to struggles within the party. It spread to the broader population. By 1966, many students had already been extensively mobilized by Mao and gradually became the primary driving force of the movement. This group of students, mostly aged 13 to 22, called themselves the Red Guards, presenting themselves in the uniform image of gray-green military attire while carrying a little red book of Mao's quotations. They were deeply convinced by Mao's propaganda, in which he frequently employed ambiguous political labels such as rightists, capitalist rulers, and reactionary academic authorities to refer to class enemies outside the party without specifying individuals. Claiming to obey Chairman Mao's directives, the Red Guards then actively hunted down such hidden enemies among the people, using Mao's vague labels as their guide. But in practice, they usually treated as such enemies anyone they personally disliked. Consequently, intellectuals were among the first civilian groups to be newly singled out as class enemies within the populace, owing both to their role as educators in disciplining students, which earned them the resentment of rebellious young Red Guards, and to their critical thinking abilities, which provoked Mao's hostility, as he did not want his favored ideology to be challenged. Soon, this charge expanded to include writers, artists, technical experts, local officials, landlords, and even rich peasants, all of whom were either social elites or independent-minded. Once these individuals were accused, they inevitably became targets of the Red Guards' persecution, which took the primary form of struggle sessions, a ritualized process of public shaming that often involved demonizing the accused and dismantling their social standing. In addition, individuals accused of minor offenses also faced ongoing social stigma, living under the constant threat of spontaneous and arbitrary abuse from the Red Guards. This grassroots persecution, combined with the intensifying ethos of political fanaticism, soon threw society into disorder that manifested in multiple ways. In many areas, young Red Guards broke into armories to fight factional battles with military weapons. They also vandalized the religious sites such as temples and churches, viewing them as symbols of the old reactionary establishment. Moreover, eager to root out class enemies, Red Guards forcibly entered private homes, ransacking personal belongings to gather evidence of wrongdoing. Although all of these actions occurred under Mao's broader orchestration and active incitement, after he had eliminated his political opponents and consolidated his dictatorship, he no longer relied on the fervent support of the Red Guards. By 1968, having stepped back from power struggles within the party, Mao turned his attention to the country's mounting social problems. 2 years of chaos had paralyzed the universities and halted factory recruitment, leaving roughly 4 million high school graduates in the cities with neither further education nor employment. Mao realized that these idle youths mingling with the fanatical Red Guards only added to the instability of city life. In response, at the end of 1968, he was promoting the Down to the Countryside movement, urging young graduates to work and live alongside poor peasants, regarded as the purest proletariat by the party, and to contribute to the development of China's impoverished regions, with the underlying purpose of easing urban pressures. Over time, it became a formal policy. Most urban high school students and recent graduates were relocated from the cities to the countryside and assigned to rural labor. As a result, the policy brought about a moderate improvement in urban conditions, but at the cost of most urban youths being sent against their will. The state's heavy-handed coercion rewrote the course of their lives and left them with enduring psychological trauma. Uprooted and disoriented, these youngsters labored half-heartedly as a matter of routine. Indeed, even throughout the full 10 years of the policy from 1968 to 1978, the 17 to 20 million school-age students who were sent to the countryside contributed scarcely anything tangible to rural development, clearly illustrating that the policy offered very little benefit and served only as the government's pointless resistance to restoring normal educational order. That being said, the policy nonetheless showed the government's intent to rein in the Red Guards' violent actions. In 1969, the central government finally disbanded the Red Guards. In the 1970s, the trend of restoring domestic order was further strengthened by Mao's personal push to normalize diplomatic relations with the US and Japan. Systematic political persecution still continued, though its form shifted from public performative spectacles to internal party meetings and political screenings. After 1972, as his energy waned, Mao partially reinstated the officials he had previously purged, allowing them to return as technocrats to manage the state. These politicians, including Deng, later emerged as the party's main forces advocating a critical reassessment of Mao. They were known as the pragmatists because of their focus on pragmatism in politics, in contrast to Mao's emphasis on ideology. Meanwhile, a small faction around Mao, composed of 4 people, rose to power through their close ties to Mao, sought to challenge the returning pragmatists. They tried to incite students to rebel, as had happened earlier in the Cultural Revolution, but unsurprisingly failed. The struggle between the two factions continued even after Mao's death, further complicated by another group composed of officials personally elevated by Mao. In 1976, Mao Zedong passed away, formally ending the Cultural Revolution and closing the Mao Era. At this point, I have summarized the major events of Mao's era. In conclusion, after the Communist Revolution, the Mao era began with the establishment of the PRC, and it was marked by the radical social and economic campaigns of the Great Leap Forward, which caused a widespread famine and cultural revolution, during which society was in chaos and political persecution occurred, and it ended with Mao's death. With this, our account of the Mao era comes to an end. Mao was unquestionably the most important figure in post-1949 China, and his legacy still casts a shadow over every Chinese person today. Yet his impact on ordinary Chinese people was imposed through sweeping, autocratic, and at times brutal policies. Some may therefore wonder why the dominant public perception of Mao in China today remains largely positive. But let's just not shy away from this slightly uncomfortable historical pattern. Figures skilled at manipulation and cruelty are often the ones most easily idolized. Even Hitler was once considered a savior of Germany. Only through thorough reflection can people fully shatter the illusions surrounding these charismatic yet tyrannic figures. In China, however, reflection on Mao was remained limited and tightly controlled by the Communist Party, which provides fertile ground for the enchantment of Maoism to resurge at any moment. But don't get me wrong, the CCP was not completely avoided reflecting on Mao. Rather, it has done so in a very limited way. This constrained reassessment began in 1978 and was led by Deng Xiaoping, resulting in significant changes within the party. As the party shifted course, China finally began to emerge from the ideological darkness of the Mao era and entered to Deng era, marked by a comparatively more relaxed and open political climate. How then did Deng reflect on Mao? What reforms did he make? And how did such reforms reshape the party and society? These questions lead us to the next chapter, the Deng era.